Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I am here with my beloved colleagues in our Gann Chapel. We are taping this on Wednesday, May 29th. It's being shown on Shabbat, June 1st. And dear colleagues and dear friends who are following this, we're thinking a lot about hope and where does hope come from in times that don't necessarily scream out for hope. And where does consolation come from in very challenging times? We could all use a booster shot of hope and consolation. And this morning, we're going to examine two very different approaches to hope and consolation. One is from the Talmud, from the tractate Makot, the end of the tractate, page 24, A and B, and it is the way that Rabbi Akiva, the great sage, and we learned about Rabbi Akiva and Rachel last week, the way that Rabbi Akiva approaches hope. And he's with a bunch of colleagues who are in a dark, dark place. And what he does, what he says, gives them hope. And the end of the tractate is, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. That's Rabbi Akiva. And the second approach is going to be Rabbi Sacks in his book, Morality, a very different approach to hope. And here's the basic question, and then we'll get into the prayer for thanking God for Torah study. Is hope a question of interpreting reality differently or acting differently? Is what's needed for hope a new lens on the old reality? We just put on a new lens and all of a sudden we see hope where we didn't see hope before. Or is a lens not enough? What we need is a new action plan. And it's on that question that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Sacks differ. So let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, v'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael, v'niyeh anachnu v'tzatza'enu v'tzatza'ei amcha beit Yisrael, kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma, Baruch atah Adonai hamalamed Torah l'amo Yisrael, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. So let me just frame the Rabbi Akiva text, which we'll look at first, with the end of the story. It's always good to know the end before you begin. It ends with Akiva nichamtanu, Akiva nichamtanu. Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. So this story takes place in the context of the destruction of the temple, of the second temple, the Churban, the year 70. And there's two different vignettes. One vignette is this group of rabbis, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yehoshua, and Rabbi Akiva, the four sages, are traveling, and somehow they hear the roar of the Roman crowd. And it's not entirely clear exactly where they are relative to it, but they seem to be some distance away. It's not like they can see it, but they can hear it, and whether they can hear it literally or do they hear the roar of the Roman crowd the same way that we hear the roar of the encampments. Like we could hear the UCLA roar of the encampment. We could hear the Columbia roar of the encampment, even if we're not at UCLA or Columbia in that way. But the other three sages, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Yehoshua, they hear the roar of Columbia, they hear the roar of UCLA, they hear the roar of the Roman crowd. They're depressed, and they lose hope, and they're in a dark place. And Rabbi Akiva says something to them, and what he says comforts them. The second vignette is they are physically, we now know where they are, they're in a place where they can see a fox emerging from the Holy of Holies. So the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kedoshim, is the holiest place. The only person who could go in is the high priest, and only on Yom Kippur Day. That's the Avodah service on Yom Kippur Day. And here in that holiest of holy spaces, that's only Yom Kippur, only the Kohen Gadol, they see a wild animal, a fox emerging from it. And the other three sages are heartbroken. Rabbi Akiva says something to them, and it does the trick. It comforts them. And I want to double click now on what is it that he says, why is it that that comforts them, and does it comfort us? And if we extrapolate, what does it teach us about finding hope and consolation in our own time? So we're on page 1 of the handout. This is Makot 24a. Once after the destruction of the temple, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yehoshua, and Rabbi Akiva were traveling on the road, Mahalchin Baderech, and they heard the sound of the Roman crowds in the plaza of Rome, 120 mil away, but they could hear it. Vehitchilu bochin, they started to weep. The other three started to weep. But Rabbi Akiva was smiling. They asked him, "For what reason are you smiling?" He replied to them, "And you, for what reason are you weeping?" They answered him, "Though these heathens who bow down to idols and burn incense to idolatry live in security and in calm. And as for us, the house which is the footstool of our God, the temple, is consumed in fire. V'lo nichbeh, should we not weep?" Rabbi Akiva then explained why he smiled in the face of tragedy. He said to them, "For this very reason I am smiling. For if such is the reward for those who transgress God's will, that they dwell in such security and calm, then for those who do God's will, how much more so, how much greater reward can we expect?" That's the end of the first story. So what is he saying? What is Rabbi Akiva? So the temple's destroyed. There is no temple. It's been burned. The Jews are exiled. The Romans are happy. They've taken all of our stuff from the temple. They're just happy. The roar of the triumphant crowd. It seems like the Jewish people is down and out. The other three sages weeping away. Only Rabbi Akiva is smiling. What's his secret sauce? Why does it work for them? And does it work for you now?
What I think what he's getting at is there's the Roman crowd is living in the immediate, and we live in eternity. So therefore, he's looking, he's looking forward to the time because we do the mitzvot. We are connected with God, and they are not, and so therefore, our hope is in the long term that we will eventually and in the end be triumphant.
Okay, so if I hear what you're saying now, what Rabbi Akiva does is the reality is the reality. There's no question that the temple is destroyed and the Jews are exiled and the Romans are celebrating. All that cannot be changed. But what Rabbi Akiva does is he puts a new lens, and the lens is what we would call, in terms of rabbinic hermeneutical principles, page 13 of the Daily Siddur, kal v'chomer, reasoning from minor to major premise. And it goes like this. If the Romans, who aren't promised by God in the Torah to be rewarded because they're following the Torah, they're prospering, all the more so we who are in covenant with God, we who do mitzvot, we should therefore all the more so be prospering. And it's only a question of time. And that kal v'chomer lens, in the fullness of time, we who are in a covenantal relationship will get our due. That is what helps Rabbi Akiva and eventually these other three sages find hope and consolation. He doesn't change the reality. He changes the lens.
But I think he's also wrong to say that they shouldn't weep because the reality is something to weep about. So, we can weep. We can be saddened. We can be depressed. We can be in a very dark and deep and bad place. And we need that sometimes in order to then eventually be able to move forward because, I think his smiling is a little bit off.
So you're not persuaded by, you don't find it cogent that he smiles, and you find their tears real and relatable.
Yeah, absolutely.
And justifiable.
Yeah.
Elias, what about you?
No, clearly he's an optimistic, right? And bringing this to our own situation these days, I would be one of the other guys weeping, honestly. I wouldn't be Rabbi Akiva. Perhaps Michelle, who is always an optimistic, will be Rabbi Akiva. It requires a certain level of being so positive that you can think that the future could be better in difficult situations. I mean, you see a building in ruins, and you would say,
well, what is
great times coming up.
Okay, so one word that one could use for Rabbi Akiva's new lens is faith, right? There's that he has faith in God, and he has faith in a longer term, in the fullness of time kind of perspective with God. And then he throws in that little rabbinic hermeneutic for no extra charge, the Kal V'chomer, reasoning from minor to major premise. Michelle or Elisa, does that get you to hope?
It will not surprise you that I think that this is a really beautiful text. I find it tremendously helpful, if not always something that we're able to embody. And the reason is for precisely what you just named, which is that this is a text of faith. This says our people are part of a much longer story. We have a trajectory that's beyond my particular experience in this moment, and I am part of a story that is in covenant with a God whose chapters are still unfolding in this world.
So Michelle, let me ask you this question. If you sign on to this, if you'll buy this off the shelf, if you like Rabbi Akiva and his approach here, what does it ask of you? What did it demand of the Jews of his time? What does it demand of you now? What's asked of you if you buy the Rabbi Akiva approach?
I think on the one hand, you could say nothing, right? You just have faith in God, and God will work in God's time. On the other hand, I think it asks one of the hardest things possible to ask of a human being, which is to imagine yourself as not the center of your world.
Say more. What does that mean?
To imagine that your life is about something beyond and bigger than you, that you may hear, right? Yes, it's true that someday, perhaps, those who, if the Romans are getting the reward now, someday, right, our descendants, someday we will see a reward. Maybe it doesn't say it here, but maybe you could even imagine kind of an afterlife glommed onto this idea that there will be something. But it doesn't give me the personal story of redemption that I want. Right. I have to sacrifice that in the service of a larger story of faith.
Elisa, what about you? Thank you, Michelle. What about you? Does this work for you?
Well, so I think he's asking the rabbis to refocus. So they go. I had a conversation with somebody actually this morning who was had just gotten an email from their elderly parent, and were just sobbing about their parent is getting older and they're so sad and they're going to die soon. And I was like, but why go there when they're here now and you can be with them now? And I feel like that's what Rabbi Akiva is doing in this moment. Like, don't go to death. Don't go to the ultimate destruction. Don't go to all the dooms of what could be. Live here now. Do what God wants of you now. Put one foot in front of the other. And then there's hope. And so I think his reframe is one of, yes, he uses this Kal V'chomer. He tries to get them to think about, like, what's going to be the greatest reward, because he's meeting them where they're at. And they're not looking at the present. They're looking at the future. But you're looking at...
No, only just that the now is pretty lousy. The now
totally.
is...
But I'm not talking about, like, he's looking at the now, but a larger now. And Rabbi Akiva is bringing them back to, like, the immediate, like, live your life the way that God wants you to live your life. Do the mitzvot. Be a functioning Jew in this moment, regardless of the destruction that's around you now, and regardless of the sounds that you're hearing that are not even, like, it's physically impossible to hear that sound. So the hearing that they have is of a greater cosmic scheme.
So, in other words, if I ask you the question, Elisa, if you like Rabbi Akiva, what does he ask of you now? Or if you like Rabbi Akiva, what does he ask of these three other sages now? The answer is put one foot in front of the other and keep living and don't give up. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So let's pause on that. There's a second story, which is a companion piece, and I'm wondering what it adds. Rabbi Akiva, okay, so then comes the second story. On another occasion, these four happy sages are coming up to Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. When they reached Har Sophim, Mount of Sophim, and were able to see the city of Jerusalem in its destruction. Now we know they can actually see the ruins of Jerusalem. They tear their garments. When they come to the Temple Mount, they saw a fox, a wild animal, emerging from the Holy of Holies, the holiest space in the planet. And they started to weep. But Rabbi Akiva smiled. They said to him, "For what reason are you smiling?" He replied to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" They said to him, "A place about which it is written, 'The non-Kohen who approaches shall die,' and now foxes prowl over it. Should we not weep?" Rabbi Akiva then explained why he was smiling. He said to them, "For this very reason I am smiling. For it is written," and now he's going to quote two prophetic texts. "For it is written, I will summon trustworthy witnesses for myself," this is God talking, "Uriah the Kohen and Zechariah ben Yevariyahu." And what connection does Uriah have with Zechariah? Uriah prophesied during the era of the first temple, whereas Zechariah prophesied during the era of the second temple. And why are they mentioned together? By mentioning the two prophets together, Scripture made the prophecy of Zechariah, the later prophet, dependent upon the prophecy of Uriah, the earlier prophet. In the prophecy of Uriah it is written, "Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed over like a field. Jerusalem will become heaps of rubble. The Temple Mount will become like stone heaps in the forest." In the prophecy of Zechariah, it is written, "Old men and old women will once again sit in the streets of Jerusalem." Rabbi Akiva concludes, as long as the prophecy of Uriah, the earlier prophet who prophesied doom and gloom, as long as that had not been fulfilled, I had feared that the prophecy of Zechariah, the happier prophet who prophesies a resurgence, would not be fulfilled. But now that the prophecy of Uriah, the destruction prophecy, has been fulfilled, and Jerusalem and the Temple Mount are totally desolate, it is certain that the prophet of Zechariah's resurgence will be fulfilled. The rabbis accepted Rabbi Akiva's reasoning, and they said these words, "Akiva nichamtanu, Akiva nichamtanu. Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us." So, the question here is, what does the second vignette add that the first vignette does not add? In the first vignette, Rabbi Akiva's move is kal v'chomer. If this happens, then all the more so that will happen for us. And in the second vignette, also looking at destruction, but not the Roman crowd cheering, but a fox in the Kodesh Kedoshim in the Holy Holies, Rabbi Akiva finds his hope and consolation in two prophecies, an earlier one of destruction. Well, since that happened, then the later one of resurrection will also happen. And by linking these two prophetic texts, he gets to a place of hope and consolation, and so do the other three rabbis. What does this second vignette add? How is the prophetic text move different from the Kal V'chomer move? Why do we need both vignettes? What's the point of the second vignette?
So I think it's one of the most brilliant uses of text that we have in our entire tradition, and in fact, a case study of how to be a faithful Jew, right? He goes back to our sources and he excavates something that can help us to imagine a different kind of a future. And so it adds tremendously, I think, to the first one, because the first one is more of a, it's a kal v'chomer, maybe this will be, it's in Akiva's voice. This one is in the voices of our text and our tradition. This is promised. This is how we understand the sacred scripture given to us by God being realized in real time. And it roots us in our story that is transcendent and eternal.
Okay, once again, what the common theme here is we're part of a big story, This moment is part of a big timeline. Our moment on earth is part of a big timeline. And Rabbi Akiva is asking us to see ourselves and our life in the context of a larger story.
Yes, and also seeing this part of our story, this actually was foretold. We knew about this. If you studied our texts, you would know that something like this would happen at some point, and here it is.
It's like you have surgery and then you have some painful complications. It's always consoling when the surgeon predicted it, right? It's not unexpected. You know, often when people have the surgery, there's this painful complication. You're having what we predicted, and Akiva says we're having what the surgeon predicted. Elisa, does this work for you?
Well, so I think yes, but in a different way, because I think Akiva's also responding to them, right? They're doing a text reading to get them to the place of doom and gloom. They're reading Leviticus. They're reading the laws of what can and cannot happen in the holiest part of our temple. And they're reading that for doom and gloom. And he's like, oh, no, if you can use a text to get you to darkness, I can use a text to get you to lightness. And so for me, it's just like, he's such a good rabbi. Like, he just really hears where they're at. And they're using tradition to help them to go into these dark depths of despair. And he's like, no, tradition goes multiple ways. Let me use tradition and get us another location.
So I want to go back to my question, which is Rabbi Akiva giving us a new lens, or is he giving us a new action plan? Or put differently, what is he asking of these other sages, and what is he asking of us in this second story?
Sorry. I don't find much differences between the first and second story. And one of the things that he has, the side note or footnote, whatever, number 2, it's a little bit in relationship with what Michelle was saying, that says that God gives an idea that they are having a good time to the wicked, but then they will be punished in the afterlife. And the Jews are the opposite. The Jews will pay in this life for their sins in order to have a beautiful afterlife.
Yeah.
And it's poetic, it's beautiful, it's, hope and for the Olam Haba, but it doesn't work for me.
Yeah, so amen to that. But Elisa, can you just go back to what, in your interpretation of the second story, is Rabbi Akiva asking of them to do something different?
Yes.
What is it?
Harness their minds, harness their emotional journey. He's like, don't go down the path of despair. Like, get back here. Like, come into the present moment, be present, hold on to hope, and then do the next right thing. Like, don't allow yourselves to just be taken over by this.
I disagree a little bit with you, Elisa. I think what he's saying is, based on your interpretation, is focus on the future, what could be in the future, not in the present, because present is miserable.
Not what could be, but what will be, because I have shown you what is now, and we have a text for that. We have a plan for that. We knew that was going to happen, and that means that by definition, the next thing is going to happen too.
Right.
So we're in this.
So I just to take our temperature real quick, like before we move to Rabbi Sacks, the sages say, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. I'm wondering, out of the 5 of us, who here is comforted by Akiva's approach in today's world? Dan, are you comforted?
No. Sorry, no.
And Elias?
I think based on personal experience, my colleague Michelle is always an optimistic, and at times it's kind of like, rewarding going to her and ask for some comfortness when I don't see good things in the future. So I have to say, it could be a little,
Could be.
comforting.
Okay, maybe it's just, well, Elisa, you're comforted by this.
I find it comforting, yeah.
Okay, Michelle?
But I'm also like, I'm moved to find it comforting based on them, and like he's meeting them where they're at and responding to them where they're at. And so if I was articulating a challenge and somebody articulated a solution to that challenge in the same language that I was using, I would find that immensely comforting.
Can we hear your voice on this?
Yeah, and Michelle, I just want to confirm, you're also...
I find it more than comforting. I find it actually brilliant and powerful, and it links to our last week's class.
Okay.
I think it was a good investment by Akiva's beloved.
So I find this totally unsatisfying. It would have zero impact because, for me, hope and consolation cannot just be, oh, here's a new lens. Hope and consolation has to be about an action plan. I mean, if life sucks, Tell me what I can do to make it unsuck. Tell me what I can do to change it. Tell me what I can do to change reality. Don't just tell me to put on a different lens and believe that in the fullness of time, when I'm dead 400 years later, things are going to work out. That doesn't do anything for me now. I want to know, what should I do, Rabbi Akiva, to change my world right now? And I feel like he's basically completely useless on that question. But we have Rabbi Sacks. So let's take a look at this. We're on page 4 of the handout. I have used the word morality throughout this book as if there were only one way for this key word to be understood. Clearly, it isn't quite so. Their differing definitions of morality illustrate perhaps the single greatest difference between the Judeo-Christian mindset on the one hand and the culture of ancient Greece on the other. The Greeks believed in, some Greek phrase here, blind, inexorable fate, often foretold by an oracle, hence the story of Oedipus. The Judeo-Christian ethic, by contrast, is about guilt and responsibility. Towards the end of his God biography, Jack Miles makes a fascinating distinction between Greek and Shakespearean tragedy. In Greek tragedy, fate is determined by factors external to the agent, outside his or her control. In Shakespearean tragedy, those factors are internal. They form a struggle in the mind of the hero. That is what makes Hamlet quite unlike Oedipus. And then he goes on to say, if we have free will, we are not slaves to fate. If at the heart of reality there is a forgiving presence, then we are not condemned by guilt. Penitence, prayer, and charity avert the evil decree, goes one of the most famous Jewish prayers. There is no fate that is inevitable, no future predetermined, no outcome we cannot avert. There is always a choice. And then he concludes, there are tragic cultures and there are hope cultures. And though some combine elements of both, the two are ultimately incompatible. In hope cultures, we are agents, we choose. All depends on what we decide. And that cannot be known in advance. In tragic cultures, we are victims. We are acted on by forces beyond our control. And then he goes on to say, the choice of freedom brings the defeat of victimhood and the redemptive birth of hope. In other words, hope is what hope does. In other words, don't give me no lens. Don't want no lens. Give me an action plan. What are you going to do different? Because that is where hope is born. So, what do you think of Rabbi Sacks?
I love it. I was thinking when I was reading this text about one of my favorite movies, Shawshank Redemption. So there's this conversation where hope is a bad thing and hope is a good thing, and the character that Tim Robbins said eventually escapes, because he thinks hope is a good thing. And it is a good thing for him because he has an action plan. He doesn't just accept it. He's hoping that eventually things will change. He acts on it, and his actions really make the outcome.
So, like most things in Jewish life.
Don't. Let me just, if I can guess, after 25 years, what you're going to say. Let me just think. Yes, and.
Yes, and.
Amazing.
Yes, and. But I love Rabbi Sacks here. I think it's brilliant and beautiful, and I think that putting it together. I'm not sure that he would have applied the two stories against each other in the way you just have, because I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for him, but I know I would not read the first story as a story prescribing inaction. Faith is an action. Faith is an approach to the world that changes your reality. And so, to me, I don't think these two stories disagree.
Okay. Elisa?
That's going to shock you. I agree with Michelle.
Okay.
I think that within this, too, what defines a hope culture isn't necessarily your own ability to act and change circumstances, but the possibility that circumstances can change. And so that's very much what Akiva is saying. He's not saying, oh, don't worry, it's no big that the temple was destroyed. Everything's fine. He's like, yeah, this whole horrible thing has just happened, and that's not the only story that's possible. I want to give you another story that's possible, and that's the root of this hope culture that Rabbi Sacks talks about too, is not necessarily the person who is a victim from their mind, not from external reality. That the same person could be full of agency and not be able to do anything.
So let me tell you why the Rabbi Akiva text is of no help to me personally, and why the Rabbi Sacks text speaks so loudly, and why I find them very contrastive texts. And I've been listening to the Israel at War podcast that Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi have been doing from Jerusalem since October 7th. And the one that came out last week, Can Zionism Win?, was so anguished. I never send out podcasts to my family members saying, listen to this, hear this, hear this, hear this. I heard that podcast, and I broke my own rule, and I sent it out to my family, and I said, you have to listen to this. Because what Daniel talks about, and it was so anguished, it was such a cry of the heart, is that he was talking about the phenomenon of anti-Zionism that is taking root among Jews. Like, how could it be that there's a rabbinical student who says, I'm not a Zionist? How could there be a Jew, given the Holocaust, who says, I'm not a Zionist, period? And he says, and so anguished if you haven't heard from it, Yossi, it comes from somewhere. It's not an accident, and it's not happenstance. And don't just give me anti-Semitism, and don't just give me the Holocaust, and don't just give me the hatred of the world that Goyim have for Jews. Yeah, it's all true. But if that's what you think, you're missing the news story here. It comes from someplace, and where it comes from is Israel. Israel is responsible in a large measure for the anti-Zionism in the world. And he talks about the violence, settler violence in the West Bank. He talks about these settler teens who are brigands on the road and ruffians on the road and stop travelers and are violent. He talks about how the IDF knows this and gives them a pass, how the military knows that the police know this and give it a pass. He talks about how Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have made lawlessness state policy, and at the highest levels it's approved. And he says, when American Jewish kids see that, they say we're anti-Zionist. It's not an accident. It comes from somewhere. And then he says, this is in Can Zionism Win? Yossi, we're out of time. We're out of time. And so when I heard that, I was just like, oh my God, we're out of time. And like, it's slipping away. It's slipping away. The darkness is here and it's slipping away. And I don't want Rabbi Akiva's lenses. I don't need a damn lens. I want Rabbi Sacks' action plan. I want us to do and to do something, to have an impact on history. And the frustrating thing is I have no idea what to do. But I do know that doing something rather than just seeing things differently feels like the right response to history now.
I have a little, sorry to say this, but I have a little bit of a different lens.
Please, go for it.
I know you don't want to hear that, but it's interesting that Rabbi Sacks brings, the phrase that we do in High Holies, Uteshua, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Ma'virin, et Roach Zeira. Okay? And by saying that by doing that, your fate could be, not will be, could be changed. All right? But how many times we heard about these cases of wonderful people in the kibbutzim who were so friendly to the Palestinians, giving them work, having friendships, and then they get killed. So there are some things that even with the Teshuva, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, we cannot control.
Clearly.
And it will happen to us.
Right. And here's the thing. Obviously. And if you take, Daniel was talking to me. I felt like he was talking to me. Because what he's saying is, if you're focused on anti-Semitism, as I have been focused on anti-Semitism, if you're focused on hatred of Israel, as I have been focused on hatred of Israel, if you're focused on the horrific double standard of the UN, which David Ben-Gurion called the UN the Shmuen, the UN the Shmuen, because all they do is hate on Jews. And I believe that is the case, right? In other words, even now, when Hamas sends missiles from Rafah, no condemnation from the UN, but when Israel defends itself, condemnation of Israel for defending itself from rockets, etc., from Rafah. For all those reasons, all that can blind you from what Israel is doing wrong, where Israel is its own worst enemy. So all that stuff is true. He's not denying it. I'm not denying it. But also, when Israel becomes a lawless culture and the settler violence that is permitted and endorsed by the IDF and by the police because of Smotrich, because of Ben-Gvir, because of the sick politics of Israel, that's a problem. And we are losing this generation of American Jews in no small part because of that. And I took Daniel and Yossi's podcast to be a call for action, and I just wanted to tee that up and to talk about, now obviously not now, we're out of time, but what is it that we can do?
To me, I think Rabbi Akiva's text actually speaks powerfully. There are foxes in the temple. There are things that are unholy, that are not right, that need to be repaired. There is a devastation all around us that has been the result of trauma and tragedy, and also trials that have not been met. And in that moment, Rabbi Akiva says, okay, guys, right, that prophecy came true. The next one is coming true too, right? There's still a Yerushalayim Shel Mala. There's still, I think in the merging of the two texts, there are still actions we can take among ourselves, that Israelis can take to root out those forces within Israel that are against the very principles of what the state of Israel, what the nation of Israel can and should be, and in so doing can return us to a place where someday the second prophecy can come true.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, I want to leave us. This is our next to last class. Next Wednesday's taping will be our last one for the year. So I don't have answers, have not had any answers since October 7th, but it does feel like a question. If you like the Rabbi Akiva approach, then your question is, what lens are you going to bring to this reality that gives you more hope and more consolation? And what does this lens ask of you now? And if you like Rabbi Sacks' approach, which is hope is as hope does, that we have agency and action is required. Also, the question is, what action is required of us now? When I think about the problem that Daniel adverted to, which is lawlessness on the highways that's supported by the government of the state of Israel, I really throw up my hands, because what can I do about that? I don't vote in Israel. I'm not a citizen of Israel. I have zero control over that. So I don't even know how to begin to furnish an answer to that question. But it does feel like if you take Rabbi Sacks seriously and we have an undying love of Israel, how do we have an honest conversation about what we love about Israel, given the reality of all the unfairness that's directed its way? How do we continue to have a dialogue with our beloved Eretz Israel to be different in ways that can bring back the next generation? Shabbat Shalom.